Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Love Pod. Let's Get Real About Relationships, a conversation series. I'm your host, Sharlene Halbert, an intimacy and relationship coach for couples in committed relationships who want more of the good stuff in their relationships and to have less of the stuff that just really is bad and doesn't work. I've always believed that more is possible in intimate relationships than most couples experience, and so becoming a relationship coach was probably a no-brainer. This podcast is to start conversations about what is possible when couples get curious and what is impacting their relationship, when they have a desire to grow and deepen what they have. So often people are either ashamed of talking about the state of their relationships or they complain and find people to validate their complaints. Through this series, I hope to bring conversations into what could be possible, what could be added in, and what could we talk about in order to create the kinds of relationships that serve us, our children, and the future. Today, I'm delighted to have Jing Sum join us. Jean is from Canberra, Australia, and she's a courage and transformation coach, a speaker, a space holder, and a Biodanza Facilitator. She supports souls in their 30s and 40s to really embody their courage and create their dreams and life on their own terms. She's also the Creatrix of the Asian Women's Rising Circle, and she won the Trainee Coach of the Year for a Beautiful You Coaching Academy. She brings a holistic approach to her work using meditation, energy practices, and movement. And her insatiable curiosity for humanity is one of the reasons that she's the perfect person to have on our show. Jean, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Hello, Sharlene. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm like a bit blown away by the bio you just read.
It's funny hearing yourself back, right?
It is.
Yeah.
And I really love your story, Sharlene, of how you became a coach and your personal journey and your belief in how relationships can be. And I was nodding my head in the backstage when I was hearing you say that people often just talk about how bad their relationship is. And I've been there before as well. So your work is just so important. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I really appreciate that. Well, see, this is what relationships should look like, right? Lots of acknowledgements. It feels so good, doesn't it? It's beautiful.
Exactly.
Got some music to liven up our conversation. Perfect.
Sorry about that.
No problem at all. So, Jean, I'd love to get us started with tell us about what are one or two things about you and your journey as well that have kind of made you the perfect person to be a courage and transformation coach, and maybe even what that is, so that people can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to share. Thanks, Charlene. So as you mentioned in the bio, I'm an Asian Australian woman, and I grew up in Australia and spent a little time in country Australia in the 80s, which was a very white dominated culture, and being one of very few Asians in this small town, let alone the school, took a lot of courage to be myself. And I wasn't popular at school because I also spoke my mind, which doesn't make a 7-year-old very popular in the playground. And so from a very young age, I learned to develop the courage part of me and potentially hidden the vulnerability part of me because the need to survive was so strong, and courage was how I found my way through. And if I look at my life over the past 41 years, I've never been happy to live status quo, to live a life that I should live, which is, I guess, more challenging given my background as a Hong Kong Chinese Australian. And if some of your listeners might be familiar with this, a lot of ethnic Chinese people Asians, the family upbringing is really focused on education, and then getting into a good, stable career. And so I muddled through that in my 20s, and I decided to leave Australia and actually go to Taiwan to work in a career as a technical writer, for which I did not study. I studied actuarial studies and commerce. So it was at that early stage I started to branch out and do things slightly differently. And so over time that has built. And when my brother passed away unexpectedly about 14 years ago now, I realized that life was too short. And so my biggest change, the first biggest change in my career, was quitting my job that I really was not happy in, which was in banking. And I decided to follow my university dreams and to go into international development, which again is not another career path that is encouraged in yeah. So I've been cultivating that throughout my life. And fast forward now to more recently, I've followed my dream of being location free. So I've been creating my coaching business and also other work to be online. So I'm not bound by a particular location. And also been calling in a new man into my life who is now in my life. And we are exploring these deeper levels of courage and vulnerability in both of us. And as a courage and transformation coach, I just love guiding and supporting people to really embody their courage and to drop into their vulnerability, to open up new possibilities in their life. Because when we follow a particular path that is shown to us, it doesn't give us a lot of scope to explore what is possible or be creative in our life. And so in my work, I work with amazing individuals who are curious and know that something needs to change in their life. And I support them through meditation, movement, visualizations, and coaching through that process.
Wow, that's an incredible journey, Jean, and I relate to the thing about growing up. I grew up in a country town in the 60s and 70s, and no less racist and challenging for obviously not for me, because I was a one of the easy ones. However, I had a mother who was not very quiet about her opinions, so I know that. I certainly don't know it as a different, having it coming from a different race from everybody else, but that experience of having to really step outside yourself and step outside that experience of smallness to find the greater who you are. So I can relate to that journey, and although it's not anything like the journey that I imagine you experienced, and also coming from that Asian family where I know I'm sort of very aware of that cultural trend to put education first. So it's an amazing story that you have. And I when you're talking, I was thinking about you and I, because you and I've spoken before and been talking about this idea of courage and vulnerability, and so much of our vulnerability and courage shows up in relationships more than anywhere else, because it's the thing that touches the most pain points that we have when you're in a relationship. And it's so beautiful that you've been able to bring all that work that you've been doing for yourself into a relationship to take it to that next level of courage and transformation. So it's really beautiful. I'd love to know, we've spoken before, you talked to me about the fact that courage and vulnerability for you are different sides of the same coin. And I'd love to know, could you talk a little bit more about that, and what is vulnerability from your perspective? Because it's a thing that I think probably most of us are most afraid of, even if we don't realize it, because because, and also perhaps there's a lack of understanding about what vulnerability really is. So I'd love to hear about a bit more about how you see that and how that perhaps even plays out for you.
Yeah, great question. Great question. I'll start off with talking about what vulnerability is, and that might support in leading conversation into vulnerability and courage. So vulnerability is, if you can imagine you're standing on the edge of a cliff and you can't really see beyond your feet, and you know that you want to take that step, but you just have no idea where that step. It could be, up a beautiful staircase, or it could be down into an unknown, or it could be just a flat piece of road. And so vulnerability, using that analogy, vulnerability is about dropping into the unknown and being open to what comes. It's about having, I always talk about you need to, it takes more courage to be vulnerable because we just don't know what's in front of us. And another example would be around expressing our emotions. Often in our current society, in our current environment, we are not encouraged to show emotions beyond joy. And there's a whole massive range of feelings and emotions that we go through and we feel. And the vulnerability in that is being able to feel and to express that emotion and feeling that's going through us in that moment. And I guess also vulnerability is about risk-taking. It's, again, when we don't know what is in front of us, and yet we feel this urge that we need to drop into that space, then there's an element of risk. And so I guess those three elements make up what vulnerability looks like and can be. So if I talk about courage and vulnerability, and those two qualities being both sides of the same coin, vulnerability has a bit of a more of a dropping in element rather than stepping forward. So if you think about having the courage to take up a new job or to move to a new city, there's a forward energy to that. There's a very, if we look at the yin and yang, the opposite masculine, feminine in some spaces, it's got the forward energy, it's got the yang energy, it's got the masculine energy of the action and to do. And vulnerability has more of that dropping in, a bit more of that receptivity of energy, the yin. Neither is better than the other, and I don't think neither can survive, can exist without the other. I'll give a very succinct example. For example, you decide to quit your job and you have nothing, you have no other job to go to, but you know you have to quit that job. So the sense of quitting and falling into the unknown is that vulnerability part. You're like, how am I going to pay the bills? What will other people think? What will I do? This is going to be bad for my career. This is going to be bad for my CV, right? All these things that come up. And so when you quit the job, then you're suddenly open. There's a sense of opening. And so you start looking at different jobs and different careers. It might be a completely different career that you decide to go. And so making applications, for example, to apply for a new job and then being offered a new job that is in a completely different career, that is courageous. That takes that, it's courage and also vulnerability, but it takes that action of, yes, I'm going to rock up to work on Monday and I don't need to wear a suit. It's doing something different, right? So does that answer the question around courage and
Yeah.
vulnerability?
Yeah, and I think what I love about what you were saying is that really there's a need for both. Like I think to be truly, what I hear you saying is in a way that to be truly courageous requires some vulnerability,
Mm,
because if we're, especially in a relationship, if we're to in order to be vulnerable, where often we have a lot of like pain from the past or things that um, get easily triggered by somebody. We've mostly Tony Robbins talks about the fact that we only really have two greatest fears in life. One is that I'm not enough, and
mm,
the other one is kind of even underneath that one, which is that I won't be loved, because to be loved is survival. At its very basic core, babies, if they're not loved and touched and held, they actually physically die. And there was apparently I've never actually found the source of this. I need to go looking again. I looked
mm,
at some stage, couldn't find it, but I've been told that there's barbaric research that was done around looking at this and babies and what happens when you don't touch them and hold them. So we all hold these incredibly deep fears that we're not enough and that we're not going to be loved. And that's why, relationships show up, are the most place that most vulnerability, why it's so scary, because if we don't get those things, we're
mm,
not going to survive. Our reptilian brain kicks in, and yet to not be vulnerable means that you can't experience the whole of who you are, and you can't experience the depths that are possible of love and connection and joy and all of those things that you talked about. Um, and so it's sort of it requires courage to be vulnerable and drop into those feelings and understand them and then express them. But it also, being vulnerable is or the other way around, sorry, in order to be courageous, truly courageous, sharing who you really are and what your deepest desires are is also necessary to move forward in life with courage. So that's kind of, does that, you don't know what, if that's how I hear what you've said, and sort of how that fits for me.
absolutely. And I could
Yeah.
think when you were just talking now, like we've all been there, being, say, the first person to say, I love you,
Mm,
takes a lot of courage and a lot of vulnerability.
mm,
We don't know how the other person will respond.
right.
And will they say it back to me? Will they not?
Mm, mm. Yes,
And so bringing
exactly.
all that, am I worthy and am I going to be loved, is
Yeah,
so fundamental in relationships.
absolutely. And safety and trust are kind of really essential as well. So there's the flip side of this too, Jean. So you know, when we're being vulnerable, uh, there there needs to be a certain amount of safety. Like I'm not. Well, I might, but it's unlikely that I'm going to say I love you to someone if there's no safety or trust to express that
Mm.
piece of vulnerability or to share my deepest feelings. And I think I'm wondering how can women and men, do you think, create that safety and trust for themselves to be vulnerable in relationships, or create that experience for themselves and for each other?
Mm,
So that vulnerability can show up. What would you say that looks like in terms of the work? And that may not be in relationships, but also just in life in general. How can
yeah.
we experience that safety and trust and create that so that we can be vulnerable?
Great question. Great question. I think, Charlene, it kind of goes both ways. So if we look at how do you create trust? Well, how do you create trust and be vulnerable? It kind of, the conditions also partly need to be there for
Yeah.
us to feel safe enough to be vulnerable to a certain degree. And yet also we need to be able to drop into the vulnerability and see what happens. So I would say initially discernment, especially for women, discernment is really important. So discernment around looking at other aspects in when you're dating, for example, whether you feel safe, whether you feel you trust this man or this other person, whether he says he'll come and pick you up, does he turn up on time and pick you up, or does he run half an hour late without telling you why? So these little signs then give you little clues as to, it builds up that, I guess, the trust bank, so to speak. And at the same time, I'm going to take the example of being vulnerable with your feelings. So just last night, as an example, I had a lot of anger and sadness was building within me. And I knew that my partner and I, my boyfriend and I, we needed to do our daily 5-minute practice on Zoom. He lives 800 kilometers away. And
Challenging.
so, yeah.
That brings a whole new level to vulnerability and safety and security and connection. Yeah.
100%. And still, it is so powerful, just as powerful in different ways as well. So yesterday or last night, I was actually procrastinating. I was doing everything under the sun to avoid it. And I was also moving house. So I could feel this emotion and anger and sadness that was building. And I couldn't quite express it by myself. And it wasn't until we got on the call, he asked me how I was, and I just started unraveling. I just started expressing my anger. It wasn't at him. It was these old childhood triggers that were coming up through me. And he looked at me and said, "Would you like to talk about it?" And I said, "Actually, I would." He goes, "Okay, let's do that instead of our practice today." And so by me dropping into my vulnerability of expressing two emotions that are not popular, quote unquote, that is not easily acceptable in society, he then stepped in to create a container for me and created that trust so that I could feel, yell, cry, all on Zoom.
I'm sure
And
Zoom has a lot of recordings of this kind of crying and stuff.
I'm sure. Yeah, and so that is an example of how it could play out in a relationship. And yes, we've been together now for 7 months, but this actually started probably even 1 or 2 months in, when I was working. We are both actually working with our coaches, and I was encouraged to bring these feelings into the space. So that was I remember, but there was one time where we're on the phone, we didn't even have visual, and I was feeling a lot of frustration and sadness, and I just didn't know what to do. I can't remember, something happened between two of us. And there was a moment where he said, "Jean, I don't know what to do, but I'm not going away. I'm not hanging up."
So
And
beautiful.
yeah, and so for me, that was like confirmation. Okay, by me expressing all this, he's still there. And so there's that, we can't really know how much we can trust someone until we let them.
That's so beautiful, Jean. I love what you're saying, and it's true because it's that who's going to take the first step. In a way, like, who do I wait for somebody to show that they're going to be there for me, or do I and do I show that I can be there for them, or do I take that vulnerable step to test it out? And and I think that's really powerful, because it does, you said it does require both, but also being able to show some vulnerability to see how it goes. And maybe you can, for people who have had a lot of trust broken in a long-term relationship, or they're starting a new relationship, it's about finding some smaller things that you can be vulnerable about, to test the waters, rather than go with something that's so big that it's going to, crash everything if they answer wrongly. But I also love what your partner said to you about, I don't know what to do, but I'm here for you and I'm not going anywhere. And that kind of safety is just so massive, because so often, and I want to get into this conversation about masculine and feminine energy in a moment, but that masculine energy desire to fix, and women have it as well. It's not about women or men. We all have these energies, and even if you don't call it that, there's this desire that a lot of us have to fix, because we need to control and have so much certainty in our lives that we've got to fix it and make it all better. And sometimes that vulnerability that he shared with you, to say, I don't know what to do, I may not know what to do, but I'm here for you, that's just so incredibly powerful, and something that I think all of us could learn from. Because I know for me, in my past relationship, the desire to fix is so strong. I inherited that. It's not just me. I know I inherited it from my mother, and probably my grandmother and great grandmother, and who knows, but how far back that goes. But that being able to stop trying to control and just allow the space, which is really scary for some people. It's scary to provide that safety in a way for somebody else, especially if you've been with somebody, or you've had a lot of experience of people criticizing you or dumping on you. Because that's the other piece of what you shared, was that you shared your vulnerability in what you were experiencing, not dumping it on him. If I'm angry, I've got many ways to deal with that. I can either be angry and make it about my partner, or shout at them, or but just being able to say, like, I feel so angry, and be able to talk about it from that perspective, as something that you're experiencing, is just incredibly powerful. And it stops the other person from going into their flight and fight and having to push back or control or fix. So there's so much in what you just said then that I just think is so incredibly beautiful. And if people, if all of us could pick that apart, and I'm sure for you, I don't know how this is for you, but none of us are perfect, and it doesn't mean that we get it right every time. But the more times that you can show up with the vulnerability, the courage, and holding the space, and doing that for each other, the better you get at it, I think.
Yeah.
Sounds like you guys are in a good space with that.
We're working, we're growing and continuously making mistakes.
Sure.
and the trust is around knowing that we both want a relationship that is really different from what we've had in the past,
Yeah.
and one that is what's important for both of us is growth individually and with each other. So I think the setting the values, like co-creating your joint values, is really important to support different qualities like courage and vulnerability.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, and something that people can also do, in my experience, in a committed relationship. When things have kind of drifted or are not great, to sit down and recreate that. It doesn't have to be a new relationship in order to heal that stuff, and it requires that curiosity and growing a desire to have something more, dreaming of something bigger, that you can create together, and to be able to sit down and start to look at what needs to shift and what can you add in, and that includes that those vulnerable pieces and being there for each other. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And even bring some daily practice. So one thing that I like to practice is, say, when we're in the car, and usually he would drive, and it I guess it's that feeds that helps to cultivate that sense of direction and leadership in the masculine quality, in the man. And for me, I'm really happy to not need to take charge of where we could need to go, navigation, decisions. And for example, when I sit in the passenger seat and I feel cold, instead of reaching my hand for the dial to fix the temperature control, I say, "Oh, I'm feeling cold," and then he'll go straight into problem-solving mode. Goes, "Oh, okay, all right. So, all right, let me adjust a warmer for you." I'm like, "Oh, actually, no, my feet are cold." And go, "Oh, okay, all right. Do you want it to your face?" And, "Oh, this sounds good." So, of course, I can turn the dial myself, right?
Yeah.
It would probably be faster than going through my head and speaking it and for him to interpret it.
Right.
But the reason I do that is me dropping into my own feeling and come into my own expression of how I'm feeling, and allowing him to step in with. He could make the wrong decision. He could make the wrong suggestion.
Mm.
He could, throw me his beanie and a big down jacket and say, "Hey, put it on."
Right.
Right? And I and that could be that is one solution.
Right.
And so there is the
And if
vulnerability
you
of.
and if you're allowing him to make the decision of how he solves that problem, then the greatest thing is to accept what it is that he's offering, right?
Yeah, that is one option. I guess another way is like, "Oh, I don't want your jacket." And so that's a bit of like a play, like a game as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so there's little practices that we can do in relationships.
Yeah, this brings us to the next thing, and I do want to talk some more about that because I know that what you just described, it can be very, for want of a better of a word, triggering for a lot of people,
Mm.
because you know a lot of women feel they don't need to, you know, they can take care of themselves. They've done a lot of, they're very proud of um, being able to take care of themselves and not needing to, that can sound like some antiquated version of the masculine and feminine role, and I know that, or the male and female role, I should say, rather than masculine and feminine.
Mm.
And so that can be very triggering. So I'll perhaps get into that, but I do want to just bring into this whole thing of masculinity and femininity, because I was talking to a friend recently,
Mm.
someone I don't see very often. We're not close friends, but we have some juicy conversations when we get together, because we have, both of us have very strong opinions, and they often don't seem to be very similar. Although often we did discover that actually having a conversation where you're open to the other person's experience instead of uh, jumping on it, we discovered, it's a beautiful thing when you discover that you have some commonalities underneath what looks like
Oh.
something completely different. It was a beautiful conversation, actually. But one of the things we got talking about was this idea of masculinity and femininity, or masculine energy and feminine energy, and you've pointed to it a couple of times. And he was like, "What's that? I don't know what you're talking about." And
Mm.
I was actually really shocked, because I guess I live in a world where that conversation is a normal thing. But for him, he'd never even heard of that concept. And what are you even talking about? And I found myself suddenly, a woman who's, got lots of things to say. I was a bit flummoxed. Like, I don't even know where to begin to explain that, because he was very much like, uh, "That's ridiculous. Like, what are you even
Mm.
talking about?" So how would you describe these? Because, I know my understanding of masculinity and femininity and how I work with it with my clients, it's very much just about energies that we have. And they're really important in a relationship. If you've got two people operating out of their feminine energy, there's not going to be any chemistry or any spark, or both operating out of that masculine energy. What could you talk a little bit about, because I know that this is an area that you spend a lot of time with, this the idea of polarity and masculinity and femininity. Tell me about how you would describe them and why they're important, and perhaps what happens when we have too little or too much of those energies. I'd love for us to get into that kind of conversation. I know, I knew you'd love it. I was dying to ask the question.
I also have a lot of ideas, and then part of me is like, oh, how am I going to succinctly talk about this? So I share.
Just relax and share what comes.
Yeah. So I'm going to use another analogy. So if we look at the sun and the moon, for example, the sun is, signifies daytime. It's got a lot of fire. It's bright. It's warm. It's hot. Even right now, it's summer in Australia. And so it's got this brightness and out there. You want to be out, out exploring, going bushwalking or kicking a ball with a dog, with kids and dog. And then if we look at the moon signifies evening, nighttime. It's dark, can be cool and a bit mysterious. You can't really see too far. And it there's a sense of being inside and being cocooned, not necessarily out in the open.
Unless you're a party animal.
Unless you're a party animal or you want to do moon circles.
Right.
So the sun, to me, it's got that outward kapow energy, like you want to get in the action, you want to go for it. And then the moon, the night, is like, there's the rest, there's the mystery in the night, there's a coolness factor. So the sun to me is more like the masculine energy. And if you also look at light, the sunlight is quite direct. There's one direct route from the source through when it hits us on Earth. And the moon for me is like the feminine energy. It's got this slightly more mysterious kind of element to it. There's a bit of the unknown. There is more receptivity, and potentially even more creativity in that space because there's more unknown to play with. And so is one better than the other? No. Can one exist without the other? Not really. Not really. So as an analogy, that's how I would describe the masculine energy. It's got more of the forward energy. It's got more of the action. And the feminine energy has more of like expression, intuition, creativity, and that's how I would describe those two elements. And so if we bring this into a relationship or even dynamic between a man and a woman, or between, the masculine energy and the feminine energy.
Right, because this is, even in homosexual relationships or, there's it works the same, right?
It does.
Energies for both people.
It does. So if we have two people in their masculine energy at the same time, what that would look like would be, there's a lot of action, there's a lot of decision making and leadership in getting stuff done. For example, if you're working in the garden, having both of you in that masculine energy is useful because you'd actually get the hole dug, you plant the tree, and the lawn will be mowed and the trees will be trimmed. Another example, if two people are in their feminine energy, for example, both Friday night sitting on a couch, and you're very relaxed. You're watching potentially, I don't know, a romantic comedy, and you've got popcorn. It's warm and cozy. You know, it's very comfortable, relaxed kind of state, which is fine. But if you take either of these situations, the garden situation and the couch situation, it's probably unlikely that either of you would feel particularly sexually attracted to the other person. So the polarity in the sense, it's a bit like if you think
Unless you
about
like how your partner looks with their shirt off in the garden.
that is true. That is true. That might really turn on the feminine goddess in anyway. So when we talk about the polarity, it's when one person is more in the masculine, the other is more in their feminine. And if we look at, say, I'm big on analogies. So if we look at, say, batteries, for example, you need plus and minus, and then you need another plus, minus to work, right? So for current to work through, to run through. So similarly, having, you need the polarity in whether you're dating or in a long-term relationship to cultivate the sexual spark, that relationships, that spark that often long-term relationships, or people in long-term relationships often say they no longer have, which Sharlene, I'm sure you've seen many clients.
Indeed.
Yeah. And so in that polarity, what that could look like is, for example, if you're deciding what to do on a Friday night, where to go for dinner, as an example. And I know there are many very independent women, and you and I, Sharlene, I know we definitely are quite powerful independent women. Of course, we can choose a restaurant we want to go and make the booking and just go. But what if we drop in the feminine? What if we drop into the space of, oh, I actually feel like something warm and cozy tonight, and I don't really want to dress up. I want something casual, and I want to spend time with you. And that could be that invitation to the masculine, where the masculine can step in with his leadership, his direction, and give, say, 3 choices. Say, oh, okay, well, let's go to this place. I hear they've got amazing tacos, or there's this place that does these amazing soups. Oh my gosh, you'll love it. So the invitation from the feminine and the feminine feeling what she feels is happening, what she desires, allows the masculine to be in that in their masculine and create that polarity. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does, and that whole the learning to understand our own shifts and what that looks like, because there's also lots of individual experiences of what those energies are, and I think that exploration is really important too, because very often there's many ways that we interact with each other. We have many parts of ourselves. We often kind of actually we do this more often with our partners, I think, or other people, is that we see them as one way, but we want them to understand that we are many parts. But we often miss that fact that we are. There's many aspects to who we are, and this masculinity and femininity is one part of that. And even if you don't use that language, it's like, what's that part of me that flows and allows and uses intuition, and what's that part of me that wants to get stuff done and make decisions, and looking to see at any time, so developing those energies in us, so that we, especially as independent women, we can often, I think, end up denying or cutting off that sort of feminine part of us. And I've had clients that have I used the word femininity one time with this client of mine who was very curiously very feminine, like, very feminine in much of her aspect, but her whole life was about drive and getting things done, and criticizing a partner for not doing what she needed when she needed it done. And there was a lot of this kind of masculine energy, and she wondered why they weren't having any sex, and she was complaining, but she drove even the sex, and so learning. And when I used the word femininity, she went, "Oh, I don't want to wear like pretty dresses and say, yes, could you, can you make all my decisions for me?" Like, it was really triggering for her. And so I think this thing of understanding, if the language is triggering, then find something else, because at the end of the day, these things exist. And it's about being open to exploring those things, and then looking at what's necessary in this moment. And I think learning to discern about, is my partner struggling with feeling like they are having that their masculine energy is necessary and available to them in this moment, or is it that they need to have that flow, and I need to step up with that sort of being the rock and or helping with the problem solving. So understanding those energies in ourselves first, and then looking for what's required right now, in order for this person to feel whole, and for my partner to feel whole and complete, and for the relationship to feel whole and complete, because the relationship needs both of those energies, as you said. Sun and moon don't exist without each other. And no relationship exists without both of those energies being present and being tended and taken care of in a way.
Yeah. And I want to also share what you've touched on around women being independent. And a lot of us have trained ourselves to take care of ourselves, to be independent, to build our career. We don't need a man to buy a house with us anymore or buy a house for us. We can do all that. And I really resonate with that, because I for a big part of my life, I had lived that as well. And in that relationship with my ex-partner of 11 years, I did end up driving a lot of those decisions. And then I wondered why he never stepped in, why he never stepped up to make decisions. Wondered why he didn't go and mow the lawn, very simple things. Because I was directing him. I was like, you should, oh, the grass is so disgusting. But again, that blame is really quite harmful in a relationship. And also, if we look at a man and a woman, and I'm just prefacing this with this example, we look at the anatomy. The penis is direct, it's straight, and it enters. I know these are not very good models. The vagina.
It's the best we've got. We'll all just use our imagination.
The vagina is the receptivity, and the penis enters the vagina. It's got that direction and penetrating energy in itself. So yes, masculine and feminine energy does not equate to man and woman, but to help illustrate this and how you could create that polarity, if we could visualize this simple, very basic, it creates life when you think about it. You need both the man and the woman to create life. And so to help illustrate the masculine and feminine, you need both. And so as women, what I've learned and what I've been experimenting with, and also with my clients, both men and women, has been in parts of your life where you are, say, running your own business or building a career. managing your own finances if you're not living together or you're early in a relationship, then yeah, bring on that boss woman. Bring on that take no crap from whoever, and create your goals, create your strategy. And at the same time, you can also bring in your intuition. It's like, oh, does this feel right to invest my money into here? I know that's what all the websites and all the investment experts say, but does it feel right for me in my body? It could be right for 10,000 other people, but it might not be right for you. Or using creativity, you're building a business. How can you build a business that you love, and bringing different elements that is about you, and using the masculine to take action and to implement? And then we look at the relationship. When you've got, yes, you're an independent woman and you've got that drive and the leadership in your own work, in other parts of your life, then it's also a really good opportunity to allow the feminine parts, the receptivity, intuition, expression, creativity, openness, invitation, chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, those things we don't really talk about, but they're really important, and that helps to build that polarity in a relationship. So for example, there's not many opportunities to be chaotic in our lives. On a Zoom, on a podcast, we're sitting very still, right? There's not a lot of.
Oh, I've thrown my hands around a little bit. Just to bring a little bit of femininity in.
Yeah. But there's that chaos also calls for that equanimity in a masculine to okay, all right, let's bring some order, some stillness, and contain this chaos a bit. But and also the feminine also needs to feel that trust and safety to express.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that goes back to, I think, that idea of learning to understand that we all have these different parts of ourselves. And I mean, even at home, there are times when the masculine energy in a woman or the feminine energy in a man needs to show up. It's not, I don't think, so I agree with you. I think it's about understanding and exploring all of those parts of ourselves so that we get really comfortable with not independent doesn't mean that we cut off that that flowy, intuitive, playful part of us. One of the biggest things that I notice goes missing out of long-term relationships is playfulness, and that's something beautiful that either party can bring in. It's one of the things I loved a lot about my ex, the relationship. We had a really beautiful relationship. It ended really just because we wanted totally different things for our lives, but we still have a very deep love for each other and respect for each other. And he was, because I can be very intense sometimes. I'm getting better and better as I get older. I think menopause helped, or being at the other side of menopause, I should say, postmenopausal. But, I can be quite intense, and I can get really like aggressive and angry at things. And he has this beautiful, beautiful, playful side that I in the beginning, I'd get really mad, like and because he would be trying to, make light of something, and I suddenly realised that when I could allow for his playfulness, it shifted everything, and it took me. It still does, because we still see each other and have a friendship, and when he's being playful, it brings out the playful in me. And kind of tones down my energy of kind of, and so playfulness is a wonderful. I feel as a feminine sort of energy that's missing in so many relationships. That when you start to bring it back, it just takes some of the tension out. So I think, I really do think that exploring those energies in ourselves and recognizing that we both have them, and in the same way for a man, so there's still so much in our cultures of men, should be a particular way, and that they need to be tough and, not share their emotions. And, male suicide is through the roof in many countries, or through the ceiling, or through whatever. Because that inability to have, as you said, you can't have sun and moon without each other, and we can't have all of one thing. We need to be able to express that, and that brings us back to vulnerability, right? That ability to be vulnerable and open to what's needed here, and which part of me is necessary. What's the part that I need to bring in right now that would create connection, create greater love, create joy, and being able to recognize when you're dropping into an energy that's perhaps not helping in this particular case. Because as you said, we can't run a business and not have some, direction, but we need, both sides of that. So
yeah, it's a bit like a dance.
yeah,
I
Biodanza, that would take us to that. Yes.
And actually tango was probably another somewhat more visual, easier example that your watchers might be able to grasp. So I dance Argentinian tango socially, and one can say it is a very traditional form of art, and some may feel that it's too what's the word, probably macho or archaic, that the response that you expressed, that you described earlier about the woman, the independent woman, and does that mean I have to wait for a man? But in this game, like starting from when you first engage with someone of wanting to dance with them, you're sitting opposite ends of the room, and there's this process, this game that we play where the man does a look, it's called cabeceo, and the woman does a mirada. And so we kind of sweep across the room with our eyes. And generally, usually the man would say, I love to dance with Sharlene. And so he'll look at you and go, we'll nod or raise the eyebrow. And the woman can have the option to accept, and you'd be like, or no, not really. And she could actually almost ignore him and keep looking around the room. And so there's that playfulness of, I'd like to dance with you. Like, yeah, maybe, but actually not this song, maybe another song. Could be that, or outright no. And then when there is an offer and acceptance, the man gets up from his seat and walks across to the woman and reconfirm, yes, we agreed to dance with each other for these next 3 or 4 songs. And then they dance. So it's a really beautiful way to illustrate what that dynamic, the playfulness could look like that you mentioned just now, Sharlene, that bring that sense of like fun, the cheekiness, and instead of, all right, that's what we're having for dinner, hun. It could be a game. It could be so much fun.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. And that, we don't have time to even, there's so much we can go into here. I might have to have you back on another series, because that's the whole thing, that dance around sexuality as well, the playfulness, around building that sensuality, especially if you've been in a relationship for a long period of time, and that what are the small things that lead up to, and that's the whole intimacy thing. Like, often it's amazing how there's still a lot of idea that sex is penetration, and that's kind of all there is. But that whole dance, that whole lead up, that whole intimacy, those looks, the little things that you say to each other, during the day, or the playful ways that you the old flirting, bring it back, I say.
Bring
that,
it back. Yeah, add some
bring it back.
spice.
Yes, indeed. Beautiful. So, Jean, as we're summing up, what's the greatest lesson that you think you've learned in the work that you do, and your
Mm,
experience? And perhaps it's hard for you, given what you do and this beautiful relationship that you're creating. Maybe it's hard to separate those out, because I guess there's a bit of it kind of all combines together. But what would you say is your greatest lesson for yourself?
yeah, in courage and vulnerability in myself, or
In
in
just
the
in the work that you do around courage, vulnerability, polarity, what do you think is the greatest lesson that you've learned?
yeah. I think with courage and vulnerability, it applies to our lives and also in relationships. It's like a muscle. The more we practice it, the easier we can access our courage and vulnerability. We know that from past experience, we tried something that really scared us, and the outcome was pretty good, or I didn't die.
Right, which is often a good thing to remember, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So building that bank, building that courage bank, building the vulnerability bank helps us in taking these steps forward. And I see that in the clients that I work with. For example, I had a male client, who wanted to work with me to call in his queen. And so we looked at things in his life that would help cultivate more of his masculine qualities of leadership and direction, to bring in and call in a woman and a queen who are powerful in her reciprocal qualities in the feminine. And it was beautiful to see him bring this live, like through, like he led bushwalking hikes around, Canberra. And he said, Jane, on the weekend, I brought in, I led a team, and I gave different people a different task. And they appreciated my leadership, but they appreciated my direction. And so I could see that cultivated and grew his capacity to access and to build on his courage. So, yeah, that's probably the key to it. Little steps at a time, it would add up, build that courage and vulnerability muscle.
That's beautiful. And really, that's I've always said, courage. That's the thing about courage. It's not something that you cut someone open and you find it there. Courage is in the action, right? It is taking those actions that you develop the courage. You don't wait till courage arrives. It's kind of
Not
yes, it doesn't. It doesn't tend to knock on our door. Unfortunately, we have to. Courage is built. I love that you've said that, because I think it's really important, and that's that part in relationships when it's scary, that you feel you don't have the courage to shift something or do something different. It's making the action small enough that you feel you can take that action, but taking an action and then another one and then another one and then another one to build that courage.
Yeah,
It's really beautiful.
exactly. And just know that it's not linear. Know the path is
Yeah.
not linear. And it's okay if you stuff up. It's okay if it doesn't work out the way your head wanted it to work out. It's okay. We're
Yeah,
all just trying to work this human thing out.
exactly. Exactly. Jean, this has been such a beautiful conversation. So much more we could talk about, and it's so lovely. I really appreciate all your wisdom and your knowledge and your experience. And I just particularly want to honour you for the beautiful relationship that you're developing, because from my perspective, having beautiful examples of beautiful relationships and people showing courage in their relationships and a desire to grow, we need so much more of that in our world. So we've just had a little bit of technical difficulty. We got cut off. So I'd love to just finish off, Jean. Thank you for waiting. So yeah, I want to just really honor you for your courage and your vulnerability in your relationship and sharing that with us so that people can know that there's hope for relationships. And that's what I really want these conversations to be about. So thank you for bringing that into this conversation as well, and for all the wonderful things that you've shared. Really enjoyed having you as a guest, and I look forward to perhaps having you on again sometime if you're up for that.
Thank you so much, Sharlene. I've really enjoyed our chat today, and I'm glad that sharing my story and my work will help serve your audience as well. And yes to chapter 2.
Fantastic. Have a beautiful day, and thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. I'll be putting Jean's contact details below, so feel free to click on there if you'd like to talk with her more about the work that she does and how she might be able to support you. And as always, live in love.